What's good, my peeps? Today I want to talk to you about one of the most underground, low-key, hush-hush trade and political wars that you haven't heard about. And this is the trade war between China and Australia. Now, for most people who will be viewing this video could be either in Africa or probably some in Australia, Europe, wherever, but for the majority of the viewers of my channel who I expect to be from back on the motherland, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's foreign investments from both of these countries, and we're talking about in total it could be over $200 billion because China has close to 170 billion in terms of the loans that the African countries owe to China, and Australia has got $50 billion plus in terms of the mining assets and just other investments that they have on the continent. And so the reason I'm bringing up this war is because a lot of these wars end up being fought by proxy, and their wars end up happening overseas, so they could carry out their wars on our shores or on our soil. And so I'm just going to break down this trade war and chronologically analyze how and when it started and what the the different aspects that it entailed. But if you're a new subscriber or viewer here, make sure you subscribe and hit like below, and it will help us quite a bit to get to a wider audience. Anyway, so the Australian-Aussie trade war, or the Chongwa and the land of the kangaroo war, did not start after COVID as many people would think, despite Australia going ahead and trying to get an investigation to happen in China as to the origins of the events of in 2020. However, there was rumors of the Chinese politicians or Chinese governments and the Chinese money finding its way into Australian politicians' pockets. I think this was in 2018 or around then. And so what happened is that they ended up banning Huawei and other Chinese companies with regards to the Australian government's procurement of technology. And so this trade war ended up having Huawei banned, and so this was just the start of the war. And so we know what happened in 2020, and so afterwards, after the calling of the investigations, that China had placed a ban on Australian exports of coal, and this ended up affecting Australia negatively, where close to $1 billion, had been wiped off the market. And however, Australia is a rich country, even though the country has tons of wealth. It still ended up affecting some individual businessmen who were in these sectors. And so the other sector that received trade restrictions on was the agricultural sector, and this happened to the mutton and barley and wine and things like that. And so all these sorts of goods started to get stuck at the ports in China, and there were unnecessary barriers to trade that started coming up, including the need for the translation of some of these goods when it comes to the export of these goods, which previously could have been just easily processed and allowed into the Chinese markets. But so what happened was that Australia got heavily fined in terms of all these sorts of trade barriers, and so the goods ended up staying in the ports. They had to pay extra demurrage charges, which is when the ships are unable, say, to discharge some of the goods that they're being ferried on there. And so for them to stay an extra day, or for a ship to stay an extra day at the port, they pay something called the demurrage. And so the other thing that affected this trade war between China and Australia is that 80% of Australian iron ore um, gets shipped to China. And so China is one of the biggest importers of Australian iron ore. And so they had to reconsider some of the calls for investigation that they had asked the other partners in terms of global trade to sanction Australia, I mean, to sanction China and do things like that. So these had to get some of these farm statements had to be recanted. And so, um, in terms of the reason why this war happened, or in terms of how this war ended up playing out in the end, one of these parties had to backtrack and go back with the tail between its legs. I don't want to say which one it is, but you can do the maths for yourselves. Obviously, we've got the reasons that this trade war and the calls for sanctions, for instance, failed, is that there's a huge difference in population between the two countries. Australia has got close to 30 million people versus China, which has got 1.1 billion people there, 1 point something. And obviously, if you've read Sun Tzu's Art of War, you can tell in terms of like the numbers and things like that, that obviously the trade war wasn't going to play out, well for one of the parties in this, dispute that happened. Anyways, so at the end of the day, the dispute was sort of resolved with one of the parties having to, backtrack and go back on the calls for investigations, even though it happened, under the radar. Now both of these countries are sort of like in a marriage of convenience, and so what's happening is that there's a huge influx of the electric vehicles that China is making in Australia, and there's still a huge influx of the number of Chinese people, in terms of in the universities, the people who are flocking in as tourists to hotels. And it just makes me think, why such a quick about turn? Did Australia change its, tack on some of the, calls for investigations, for instance, that they had and the sanctions it was calling for? Anyways, because of change of the political leaders, each leader probably has their own difference or difference in leadership styles. One saw the one side being a smarter way to deal with things than the other. But anyways, one reason why I'm bringing this up is that both of these countries, if we want to compare them in terms of the political ideologies, there's a sharp contrast in between the demographics in both countries in terms of the political ideologies. For instance, China has got the communism, and Australia is a democratic country, and there's still like a difference in terms of the work ethics in both of these countries, even though the GDPs are quite high. Australia's got 30 million people and still puts out a GDP of 1.53 trillion US dollars. China, with its 1.1 billion, pushing out a GDP of about 12 or close to 13 trillion US dollars. I don't know, just around there. But in terms of both of these countries, there's a huge pay difference in both of these countries. Even per hour, and in terms of like the societal considerations, Australia is considered to be more progressive when it comes to human rights and things like that. But there's quite a bit that is, you can't really compare apples and oranges in that sense. But there's a huge difference between these two countries. And one other thing that I wanted to mention is that the reason why the trade embargoes that one party wanted to implement against the other ended up backfiring, is that China has been investing in so many countries. And so even in Australia, a lot of the investments that had happened before 2018 in some infrastructure in Australia, which could be considered as critical infrastructure, had happened. And in terms of the loans, there ended up being huge backlash on the leaders that signed some of these agreements with China. But it still showed that the political might of the Chinese should not be underestimated. And yeah, I think that's one lesson that Australia learned the hard way.